name means the heel grabber, the supplanter, the one who gets ahead by hook or by crook. The Bible doesn't hide the shady behavior of this guy. He cheats his brother, tricks his aged blind father, has to run away from his brother's rage. You can read about one of Jacob's low-down deeds in Genesis 27. But even though he gets the blessing by underhanded means, God appears to him in a dream and makes an amazing promise to him. Just listen to Genesis 28:12. And he dreamed that there was a ladder set up on the earth, the top of it reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it, and the Lord stood beside him and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give to you and to your offspring, and your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth. And you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south, and all the families of the earth shall be blessed in you and in your offspring. Know that I am with you, and I will keep you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. What did I say? God is a God who makes and keeps promises. The Jacob stories are stories full of twists and turns. He falls in love with the beautiful Rachel and works for 7 years for the right to marry her. But on his wedding night, his father-in-law Laban deceives him, and he ends up marrying the older sister Leah. But his love is so great, he works 7 more years so he can marry Rachel too. There's enough material here for several soap operas. In summary, he ends up having 2 wives, both of whom give him sons, plus each wife presents him a maidservant, and each maidservant gives him sons. He ends up with 12 sons. Father Abraham had many sons. Remember that number 12. It'll show up again. After many years of living and prospering in the land of his father-in-law Laban, Jacob decides to return to the land that had long ago been promised to his grandfather Abraham. Of course, that means going back to face the wrath of his brother Esau. Jacob sends gifts to Esau out ahead of his caravan. But then he gets word that Esau is coming with 400 men to meet him. Uh-oh. It looks like all of his slick living is going to catch up with him. He spends the night alone on the banks of the river and has an encounter that changes him forever. You can read that story in Genesis 32, beginning at verse 22. In this story, Jacob strives with God and survives. So God gives Jacob a new name, Israel. This man, Israel, formerly known as Jacob, has 12 sons. Each one represents a tribe or a clan. The 12 tribes of Israel become God's chosen people. And just to give you a hint of future lessons, 1,800 years later, when Jesus comes to begin a new chosen people, a new covenant, a new testament, how many disciples does he choose? Right, he chooses 12. You will find as you read through the Bible that Israel and Jacob are names that are used interchangeably. They both refer to the patriarch, son of Isaac, grandson of Abraham, the one who sired 12 sons, who are traditionally held as the fathers of the 12 tribes of Israel. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are the 3 patriarchs held up throughout Scripture as the founding fathers of God's chosen people. The last story in Genesis tells the adventures of one of Jacob or Israel's sons. His story serves as a bridge to the next episode in God's human reclamation project. The story of Joseph is told in Genesis 37 and then continues in Genesis 39 all the way through 50. It's a novella, a complete full story, unlike anything else in the Bible. I encourage you to read it. Joseph is the firstborn son of Jacob's beloved wife Rachel. Joseph's not the oldest, but he is the dearest to his father's heart. He is the one who receives the amazing Technicolor dream coat. He is the one who is sold into slavery by his jealous brothers and ends up in Egypt. But he does well in Egypt. Then is imprisoned on false charges and languishes in prison. Joseph's life is one of dramatic ups and downs. But running through the story is a constant refrain. The Lord was with Joseph. In slavery, in prison, in the pit, the Lord was with Joseph. The culmination of the story comes when Joseph's brothers show up in Egypt to buy food. Joseph is now the overseer of the country's resources. Their future is now in his hands. Joseph tests them. Then he cries over them. And finally he says to them in Genesis 50 verse 20, "Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good in order to preserve a numerous people as he is doing today." Isn't that an audacious thing to say? God can use even human misdeeds to reach God's purposes? The brothers sinned against their brother, and they were accountable before God for that sin. But the sin did not derail God's plans to save the chosen people in order to reclaim the entire human race. God will keep God's promises. As we end this story of the patriarchs, let's take a look at the state of those promises. To Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, God promised a great name, a great nation, a great blessing, and a secure home. At the end of Genesis, the great nation numbers 70 menfolk and their families. The great name and the great blessing are nowhere to be seen. In fact, they are all migrant workers living in Egypt. Not a very promising future. And sadly, the only bit of land that truly belongs to these nomads is a cemetery that Abraham bought in Canaan when his wife died hundreds of years earlier. As the book of Genesis ends, the covenant promises haven't yet been fulfilled. I'm sure these sons and daughters of Israel living in Egypt remembered the promises, and they wondered, how long must we wait? Just like all of us, their doubts wrestled with their faith. Like us, they needed to remember God's faithfulness in the past and how God had brought them this far. Like us, they needed to remember and call on God in order to live. In our next session, we will learn about the most important event in the Old Testament, the Exodus. Here are some questions you might think about. How long are you willing to wait for God's promises to come true? Abraham was asked to leave everything behind and head out to an unknown land. Has God ever asked you to do a difficult thing? And then read again Genesis 32, verses 22 to 32, that story of Jacob. What was going on? How would you interpret this story? And then I end with a few sites that you can check out. Here's a great free Bible map site. And if you want to dig in deeper to any of the Genesis material, you can look at some articles on this website. Thanks a lot for listening. You have a great day.